Hi class, it's Dr. DiBiase, and we're going to be talking about should writers use their own English, which is an article by Vershawn Ashanti Young. There is a lot that we could talk about with this article. It raises a number of really important questions that are both important to the field of writing studies with respect to language and literacy practices, but are also they're issues that I take rather personally for reasons that I'll get into as we make our way through this presentation. So in some ways, if you're only going to pay attention to one of these lectures this semester, although I hope you're going to pay attention to more than one, this may very well be it. So let's buckle in and quickly move through and see where we end up. So I start off here with Yoda. If we were in an in-person class, you would certainly know more about my affinity for Star Wars and all things geek, and some of you may have even picked up on the various Star Wars shirts I wear during our office hours. And I invoke Yoda here because Yoda has, if you've ever watched the Star Wars movies, has some particularly unique ways of phrasing his thoughts, right? And the order of his sentences does not conform to what we might consider sort of standard English syntax, right? The order in which things appear, and yet no one doubts his wisdom and no one doubts his intelligence. And so this is sort of a semi-facetious way to get in here, right? But the idea of why is it, for example, that issues of grammar become this sort of really heated topic in terms of how we judge other individuals. Another character you might be familiar with who has some interesting grammatical approaches is Cookie Monster. We have a lot of Cookie Monster going on in my house because I have young kids. And if you've ever watched Sesame Street or are familiar with Mr. Cookie Monster, you know that his approach to language is distinct in some ways, in that he typically uses me, which is traditionally considered an object pronoun, as a subject pronoun, right? So instead of saying I speak just fine, he says me speak just fine, right? And I bring up Cookie Monster because my mother takes a real issue with Cookie Monster, right? She thinks that Cookie Monster teaches kids to speak incorrectly, or he reinforces bad speaking habits. And I have to, my mother was surprised when I sort of came to Cookie Monster's defense, because my doctoral work, my PhD is in writing and rhetoric, and surely, as someone who teaches writing, I would also find this problematic, but I don't, not at all, because the cool thing I think about Sesame Street, right, is everyone knows what Cookie Monster's talking about, right? No one's, Big Bird's not walking around, judging him as inferior because of how he speaks. Everyone just sort of gets along with their day, and there's no real major communication issues, right? And so why I bring up these examples may become more clear as we go through this. So I apologize here for this wall of text, but I think before we get into our conversation, we need to define a couple of terms, especially before we get into the young piece, right? So let's start really quickly with grammar, right? Grammar is the structures by which we make meaning in a language. It's not really about correctness, right? And so I'll have students frequently say things like, oh, I'm really worried about my grammar, or I have bad grammar. And my response to them is always, do people understand you when you're talking? Because if they do, then your grammar is fine. You may not know all of the formal grammatical terms and all that jazz, but internally, at least, you understand the structures by which meaning is made through language in your particular language, right? And there's no one correct grammar, right? Different languages have different grammatical approaches. I am not going to punish you by making you listen to me speak Spanish in my terrible gringo accent. However, right, if you've taken Spanish, or you know Spanish, or you speak Spanish, you understand that, for example, adjectives go in a different part of the sentence, or have a different positionality with respect to nouns than they do in English, right? So in English, we might say I have a red balloon, and we put the adjective in front of the noun, right? The descriptive word in front of the noun. And in Spanish, it's reversed. And neither of these is better or worse. It's just the way that particular language evolves over time, right? So when we think about grammar, right, we need to think less in terms of correctness, and we need to think more in terms of the ability to make meaning. And that will play a big role in our conversation here. Two terms that Young brings up in his essay are the terms prescriptive and descriptive. And these refer back to different sort of philosophies of linguistics, right? So are you a prescriptivist? Do you subscribe to prescriptivism, or are you more of a descriptivist, or into descriptivism, right? So if you're a prescriptivist, right, to prescribe, right, this sort of mindset is about sort of seeing and teaching language as a rule system, and is primarily concerned with trying to establish what are the rules that make language work, right? So what are the rules of a language that make it function? And so if you were teaching in a prescriptivist manner, right, you would be trying to say, okay, well, I'm going to teach you this language. These are the rules of the language. And I'm going to make sure that you master these specific rules. An alternative approach is something that's called descriptivism, right? And so in this model, right, we treat language as something that simply is, right? Language evolves over time, and it exists in a variety of formats. And so scholars who sort of focus this model are less concerned with sort of like, what are, let me show you what the rules of the language are. Instead, they want to go and try and describe the way that people actually use language, right? Because as Young will point out eventually, no one uses, the same standard all the time anyway, right? So again, prescriptivism is really concerned with rule systems. Descriptivism is really more about how do we talk about the way that language operates. Young is going to bring up two similar terms, code switching and code meshing. So code switching typically refers to the way in which people can move between different dialects based on the context. So they might use one dialect at home and another dialect at school or at work. And we'll talk about dialects in a moment. In code meshing, which is something that Young he sort of coined this term, right? He came up with this term, and he's a very strong proponent of, is the idea that an individual doesn't simply use different varieties of a language based on their context. They are able to draw from all of the varieties of language that they have access to based on their context. And so if it makes sense, for example, in the middle of a scholarly paper to draw upon a quote-unquote non-standard variety of English, then they will do so because they have a writerly or rhetorical reason for doing so based on that context. He talks about accent. We'll touch on that really quickly here. So obviously I cannot see you, but I'm going to ask you, raise your hand if you have an accent. And everyone's hands should be up right now, right? Because an accent is an audio quality of our spoken language, and that gets shaped by context, right? So if you think you don't have an accent, go to another part of the country, and I assure you, they will point out that you sound funny to them, right? Whether that is a Boston accent or an Appalachian accent or a Southwestern accent, right? Different parts of the country carry different accents. Accents can be shaped by other kinds of language practices, right? So my great grandparents, spoke English, but it had an audio quality to it that an outside listener would hear and say, they are most likely from Europe originally, and most likely from Italy, right? And so we all sort of carry an accent, and Young will point out that the way that we talk always sort of signals something about where we're coming from. And when we talk about a dialect, which is in many ways just sort of another variety of a language, right? What's important to note here is that there are many varieties of a single language, right? There isn't one single version of English. I once had a student, an international student from England, and after class she pulled me aside and said, and again, I'm not going to butcher her accent, but she said, "What did you Americans do to our beautiful language?" Right? And the English that's spoken in England is not the same as the English spoken in the United States, not the same English that's spoken in Canada, not the same English that's spoken in India or Pakistan or Australia or New Zealand, right? These are all varieties of a language, right? They all fall under the larger English umbrella. But even within a single country, you can have multiple varieties of English. And the key thing to drive home here is that these varieties of English are internally consistent, right? So as you will see when you are looking at the Young essay, he employs varieties of what we might call either Black English or African American Vernacular English. And a more prescriptivist reader might say, well, he's violating all these various grammatical rules. And what a descriptivist might say is, he's not violating any rules, because in that particular dialect, he is using the rules of that dialect consistently. And so these aren't errors, they're simply another variety of English. So that established, let's move along a little bit. So some background. In 1974, the National Council of Teachers of English published a statement, sort of a position statement called Students' Rights to Their Own Language. And this is actually what kicks off this essay. And this document was basically written in the 1970s to argue that students should not be forced to conform to a singular standard of spoken or written English in the classroom, for a variety of reasons, right? But primarily that language is tied to identity, that our language practices are deeply shaped by where we come from, and that no one singular language practice has any sort of moral superiority over any other. Now, the Young article starts off by with a quote by Stanley Fish, who's a pretty influential literary critic. He's on the older side, saying that, you know, we need to get rid of this idea of students' rights to their own language, that this is ridiculous. And one of the arguments that Fish makes is that if you give students rights to their own language, they might engage in language practices that could subject them to the experience of racial prejudice, right? So if you tell a student, right, a student of color, it's okay to write in the same sort of variety of English as used in your home community, this might open up that student to being judged prejudicially based on not just their writing, but their race. And we'll come back to that argument as we make our way through, and you'll see how Young sort of deals with that. Another name that comes up here just really quickly is Gerald Graff. We're not reading a Graff this semester, but Graff is also a very influential literacy researcher who sort of predates Brandt a little bit, but also a big name in the field. And Young draws on Graff a little bit here to sort of push back against Fish. So what is Young up to, right? Right off the bat, as soon as you start reading this, you will notice that Young is taking a very different approach to his writing than what we typically see in an academic article, right? He is writing in a particular variety of English. And he's doing this intentionally, right? It's very important to note here, like, Young knows what Young is doing. I've actually met, Dr. Young at a couple of conferences at this point. Incredibly intelligent individual who knows what he is doing, right? And so what he's trying to do here is push back on the notion that there's a single standard. He wants to point out sort of some hypocrisy, right? That for example, Stanley Fish is saying that he wants to avoid students running into being the victims of racial discrimination while engaging in practices that are racially discriminatory. And he wants to challenge reader expectations, right? So a common argument for a single standard is that, well, if we don't have a standard, we won't understand each other. And what Young would sort of say is that is bullshit, which I agree with, right? We understand each other just fine if we're willing to put in the time to listen carefully, right? For example, I don't think that there's anything that is, if you look at this article, there's nothing that's difficult to understand about the writing in this article if you give it your attention. Some of the concepts might be challenging, right? But that's not about the language. That's about the intellectual concepts that are being put forward. So let's talk about this idea of a standard, right? Here's the big question. If there are lots of varieties of English, and there are many varieties of English, right? What determines the standard? What makes something the singular standard by which, textbooks are written and students are judged and papers are graded, blah, 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 blah. And many literacy scholars, and Young doesn't necessarily see himself as a literacy scholar specifically, but I think he falls into this camp, at least with this piece, right? I think, Young, Brandt, certainly we're going to look at James Paul Gee next week, would agree that it's primarily a question of power and privilege, right? It should come as no surprise that the standard, the quote-unquote standard of a language sounds an awful lot like the variety of that language spoken in affluent majority race households, right? So in the U.S., and this comes back to Brandt a little bit, right? In affluent white households, neighborhoods, communities, right? That the kind of English spoken, the variety of English spoken there, tends to be seen as the standard, or at the very least, there's very, very little distance between the two. So why does this matter? And there are many reasons why this matters. So let's think of I'm going to say it's a yellow dot. I'll be honest with y'all. I'm pretty colorblind, so that could be green. And I'm guessing that the other dots are either blue or purple or something like that, but it's not that important. Let's say that yellowish dot represents kind of the standard language practices of school and work, right? The way in which we typically talk about standard English. There are many varieties of English, right? Some that fall closer to that standard and some that fall further away. And so if we look here, right, we might say, well, this might be and as you know, right, the distance from the standard is usually a factor of both, race, ethnicity, and economic status. So for example, you might have, white working class Englishes here, varieties of white working class Englishes here. You might have certain varieties of African American vernacular English here. You might have the kinds of Englishes that are spoken in what are called Generation 1.5 households. Those are households where the parents might be immigrants, and the children primarily speak the home language of their parents in the house, but speak English outside the house. So that might be like over here. And again, this is very abstracted, right? But right here, right by that standard, right underneath it, right, you're going to find language practices of, at least in our country, right, in America, basically white, upper and upper middle class communities. So there's very, 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 very little distance between the two. Again, metaphorical distance, right? There's a lot of overlap in the practices that are taught in school and the home practices that people growing up in these communities speak. And I can, to a certain degree, speak from experience. I came, I am a, white individual. I grew up in a relatively affluent home. And so I can recognize, right, that the language practices that I was expected to make use of in the classroom were not particularly distinct from the language practices that I was asked to use in my house, right? Whereas and what's important to know, there's I did nothing to earn that, right? That just is the way it happened to be. Whereas many other individuals, right, are born into communities where their language practices are further removed in terms of the way in which language is expressed within these communities. So why is that important, right? Why is that important to visualize and keep in mind? Well, from Young's perspective, right, and from many literacy scholars' perspective, right, no variety of English is inferior to any other. They're simply different, right? There is no objective value to be assigned to a particular variety of English so long as it's internally consistent. So for Young, right, the problem is not that individuals speak non-standard Englishes. The problem is with attitudes toward those non-standard Englishes. And so Young, Stanley Fischer is arguing, well, if you let students speak, or write in African American vernacular English, for example, those students are going to be subjected to racist attitudes when people read their writing, and that's a problem. And Young would say, yeah, it's a problem, but the problem isn't the writing, the problem is the racists, right? The problem is the racist attitudes. And so if we go back, we'll go back here, again, not to make too light of this, the problem here is not with Cookie Monster's English, right? The problem here is with people who have a problem with his English, right? Because you understand what he's saying, and if you were to act as if you could not, then I would argue you're acting in bad faith, right? That you're just doing it in order to make a point, but that you really, that's not truly reflective of what you can and cannot perceive. So again, if students might be subjected to racist attitudes because of their language practices, Fish and others like Fish would argue, well, then they should change their language practices. Young and those who sort of side with that perspective would say people need to change their racist attitudes. And sometimes when I teach this, teach Young, I often get some pushback from students who will suggest, well, that that's just the way things are, right? But I think Young is hoping for better, and I certainly am hoping for better. So just putting that out there, right? And to that point, right, again, Fish is victim blaming, right? He's blaming the victims of racial attitudes for being treated in that way, which I don't think Fish would say that he's doing, but I think Young will make a particularly good case that that is what's occurring, right? Young also points out that no one speaks the standard perfectly all the time anyway, right? I certainly don't, and I've got a PhD in writing, so I mean, he gives plenty of examples of tweets and other quotes, including Fish himself, where people who we would presumably expect to use the quote unquote the standard don't, for various reasons, right? And the key point he wants to drive home here, right, is that standard, right, the idea of a single standard sets an enormous and dangerous double standard. It basically says that the home practices, right, so we all have home language practices, right? We grow up in a particular environment, we develop language practices, and we'll talk about this next week with James Paul G, who will talk about that as your primary discourse, right? We all have a primary discourse. This double standard, right, this insistence on one standard English basically says white affluent language practices, right, the ones that you speak at your home in a white affluent household, are worthy of being used in school and at work, and the home language practices of everyone else is not. And so we run into sort of almost a separate but unequal scenario here, right? Well, they're all, your home language is your home language, this is my home language. Why does yours get to be privileged in the classroom and mine does not? And this is where we get into this question of, Brandt talks about institutional sponsorship, right? Well, what happens when you have institutions that sponsor certain literacy practices over others? The reality is that enforcing a single standard does provide a clear advantage to affluent white students. They have to do less mental gymnastics to move from their home language to the language of school. Now, again, some might argue then the problem is that other people's home languages should conform with this particular language, whereas the alternative perspective would be like, we just need to broaden our concept of what works as a language. It reinforces racist attitudes towards students of color. There's an interesting piece here by Joseph Williams in Writing About Writing that we're not going to look at just for lack of time, but he ultimately makes the argument that our assumptions about writers impact the way we read their writing. So if we go, and so he notes that, like, for example, we tend to find more errors in first-year student writing because we treat them like students, right? And we expect to see error. And so this practice only serves to reinforce sort of negative racial attitudes towards students of color. And I would also argue, and Young gets at this a little bit here, right, that it also reinforces classist attitudes towards working class students. And it's a smaller part of Young's project, but there are distinctions between working class Englishes, white working class Englishes, and the working class Englishes of persons of color that distinguish those kinds of Englishes from, the quote unquote standard. And so in the same way that this singular standard can reinforce racist attitudes, it can also reinforce classist attitudes as well. So in terms of solving the problem, right, Young would say that the issue is really about changing our attitudes and teaching practices, not about changing students or forcing them to conform to a single standard of language. And that, in fact, we would all benefit if we broadened our scope of the kinds of varieties of English that we felt comfortable using and writing in, because there are strong rhetorical reasons for being able to do so. And one of the reasons, why I think this issue is important to me, or why I think it's worth thinking about, is prior to working at Fairfield University, I taught at a college for 6 years where my students were predominantly, students of color, who had firsthand experience of being, feeling as though their intelligence was being judged by teachers who were holding them to a particular kind of language standard, in ways that students like myself never had to contend with, right? And so as you're reading through the Young piece, remember the things that we talked about in terms of how to be kind of a good reader. So read generously. I think it can be, you're going to get into this reading. It's not going to look the way that you necessarily expect it to. That's intentional, right? Jung wants to push you a little bit. And when we come out of that reading, we can talk more about, do we find Jung's argument compelling? What were the implications if you sort of follow his argument through to its conclusion? And what do we think about the case that he's sort of arguing, and the means by which he does that, and the rhetorical moves that he makes in order to do that? So good luck with the reading. Check out the group discussion posts tomorrow, and we'll continue this conversation there. And hope everyone's doing well. Take care.